All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure some other people will trickle in. So what we're going to do today is continue on with our conversation about, areas of unprotected speech. Again, as a reminder, these are categories of speech that the Supreme Court has determined were never intended at the time of the First Amendment's writing or subsequent incorporation, be like the 14th Amendment and stuff like that, to be constitutionally protected. And therefore, they can be regulated pretty much whole cloth by state, local, and federal governments. So we ended last class by discussing a hate speech, or not a hate speech, but almost like a hate symbolism regulation that the city of St. Paul passed back in the early 90s. And that statute essentially criminalized the display of particular really abhorrent iconography. So Nazi swastikas or burning of crosses, things that are traditionally and or not traditionally, because the swastika had a lot of uses before 1930s and 1940s, and now only really has one use, especially in Western culture. But is really identified with a particular hate group or a hate movement, such as Nazism or white supremacy. The Supreme Court struck that down, struck the display of, a law criminalizing the display of these symbols as violative of the First Amendment because it targeted specific viewpoints and just targeted specific content. The Supreme Court said, look, there are a lot of reasons why we are constitutionally or suspect of this particular type of regulation, but one of them is it only targets certain types of discrimination. And while white supremacy and Nazism are certainly high up there in terms of social ills that we seek to rectify, either go after bigotry, go after racism, go after these issues all at once, or don't do it at all. You're not allowed to pick and choose because that is the type of government regulation that is relatively ripe for abuse. So, but the Supreme Court did not say, look, cross burning in all contexts is constitutionally protected. In the same way that flag burning, as we saw in Texas versus Johnson, is not always constitutionally protected. If I go up and I see, I'm sure you guys drive around and you see houses with American flags on them, right? If I went up and I burned that, and I was on somebody's house, and they come out and they say, I'm calling the cops, and I'm getting you arrested, and I say, haha, Texas versus Johnson, 1983, or 1987, you can't do a darn thing about it, because I have the right to burn an American flag. They're going to come, they're going to arrest me for destruction of property, they're going to arrest me for trespassing, they're going to arrest me for arson, potentially. They just can't punish me for the act of burning the flag. They can punish me for the act of burning something. So that's kind of the natural progression of RAV versus City of St. Paul. And then we get to 2003 with another cross-burning case called Virginia versus Black. Now, one of the things that, there were a lot of problems with the City of St. Paul's arguments in front of the Supreme Court. One of them is that they were using a fighting words argument, essentially saying that when you display Nazi swastikas or you display or you burn a cross, there's a potential or a likelihood even of an imminent breach of the peace. And we can obviously understand situations in which that would be the case, right? I go up to a synagogue during a temple gathering when there are people there in plain view and I paint a Nazi swastika, there's a very real chance for violence there. That could be definitely considered fighting words. Same goes for burning of a cross. But if it's in the middle of the night or it's on private property or, whatever else, there isn't that same breach of the peace. And when you're talking about speech regulations, you really need to, the regulation really needs to apply in all circumstances. Otherwise, it's not narrowly tailored. And so that was one of the many reasons why RAV versus City of St. Paul was kind of a little bit dead on arrival, to be honest with you. Now we're going to talk about true threats. And true threats are different than fighting words. I think you guys probably coming into this class were aware that threats are not constitutionally protected. You can be arrested for threatening somebody. You can be arrested for harassing somebody, for stalking somebody, right? There's targeted speech against a particular individual that puts them at risk of physical harm or puts them in fear of physical harm. That can be regulated. That can be criminally punished. I think you guys all probably kind of knew that coming in, right? You all kind of knew that, cyber stalking wasn't this most people know that's a crime. You can be arrested for it. Or harassment is a crime and you can be arrested for it. And this is kind of why those crimes are, in fact, crimes, despite the fact that they are wholly speech regulations. All right, so let's get to the definition. Defined is a speech or symbolic expression intended to create a pervasive fear in victims that they are the target of violence. That is incredibly important, target of violence. We talked a few classes ago about how hate speech laws are unconstitutional in this country. Hate speech laws in the United Kingdom and France and Germany and these other Western democracies that are the signatories of hate speech treaties say that hate speech and these thoughts that are being expressed and put out into the public are, put somebody at risk of emotional harm. That's valid, right? You use a racial slur against somebody, that creates a very real harm. I'm not diminishing that, but it's not a physical harm, right? There's not that fear of physical violence, and that's the issue. The Supreme Court has literally taken the approach of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me, okay? At least when it comes to true threats. Now, there's no requirement in true threats, the true threats exception to free speech, that the defendant actually carry out the threat. So you don't need to prove to a jury that when somebody threatens to stab somebody with a knife, that they have a knife, they're in close proximity to that person, that they have the subjective intent to actually carry out that threat. What's being regulated here is the actual threat itself. And I think it's helpful when we're talking about criminal actions. What is the harm that we are trying to protect against here, the societal harm? Some are incredibly obvious. You steal somebody else's money. We criminalize that because the harm is literally we can measure it monetarily. The harm to society is somebody losing their money, which is theirs, harm of property interest. Somebody is convicted of murder, the harm is the loss of life for that individual. The harm here is the emotional harm that somebody suffers from thinking that they are in imminent bodily harm, okay? And that is, I've heard a lot of criticism, and I don't even necessarily think it's invalid, that says, fear of, you're protecting against emotional harm, right? Because, you're not trying to stop physical harm. That's what we have fighting words for. Or if you were only concerned about preventing physical harm by nipping it in the bud, like we do with incitement, then you would have a limitation saying that there has to be intent on behalf of the defendant. We don't have that here. I'm sorry. Something's going on with my throat. Here, we're protecting against the victim's mental health. Couldn't you apply that same thing to hate speech? With racist, feeling harm because you were subjected to racist or sexist or homophobic speech? Certainly a valid criticism, right? But the harm is the fear, not the actual physical violence. All right. So, Virginia versus Black. Oh, I missed a slide. I apologize about that. So, I guess it got deleted by accident. Okay, so let me give you some background on Virginia versus Black. In Virginia versus Black, there are two distinct defendants here, okay? And that'll sometimes happen at the Supreme Court, where you will have differing factual cases combined to be heard by the Supreme Court at the same time, so long as they can both be resolved by the same legal question being answered here. Again, The Supreme Court doesn't care about what is essentially a small potatoes criminal conviction down in Virginia. They got a lot of more important things to deal with. What they are concerned about is the ability for governments as a whole to criminalize targeted racist expression against an individual. So, in one case, you had the leader, or at least the sympathizer of a local KKK organization in Virginia. And there was a crime, and Virginia recently passed a law making it a crime to burn a cross where it could be seen by the public. So even if it's on private property, if it can be seen by the public at large, that is a crime by definition. Actually, not by definition, I misspoke. It is a crime if there was an intent to threaten or harass individuals. And the statute created a presumption saying that when a jury is sitting in judgment over a defendant, the mere act of burning was enough for them to presume intent to threaten. Essentially, that the default position is that when you burn a cross, you're trying to threaten somebody, typically a black individual or a black family, but there are a lot of people that KKK hates, right? They hate Jews and Catholics, and essentially if you're not a Protestant heterosexual white person, the KKK has an issue with you. And the presumption is that if you're a member of one of those groups, you see a burning cross, which typically, is targeted against African Americans, but that there is an intent to threaten there. And then the burden is on the defendant to show that they were not trying to threaten somebody. So we have one person. They are burning a cross in their backyard. It can be seen from the highway, but they're on private property. And it was part of a ritual, right? People would get together. They were part of the Klan. They would talk about how much they hate all the people I just went over. And then they'd all get together, and the grand finale was that they light up a cross. Compare that with the other defendant in this case, who actually did something very, very similar to what happened in RAV versus City of St. Paul. Went onto the lawn of a black family, burned a cross, and then ran away. And the result is, and so Black was the local KKK leader, which I find, not sure if I'm supposed to find it funny or not, but I do find it incredibly funny that somebody with the last name Black is the Grand Wizard of the KKK, but what do I know? And then the convictions for the other people, the ones who went into the yard, they were called Elliot and O'Mara. They were two separate individuals. And they got mad because the family that they burned the cross in reported them to the cops for shooting guns off in their backyard at 2 a.m. So they seemed like really lovely people. They were upheld. And the reasoning that it was, and it's a very difficult case to kind of process. I'm going to try and walk you through it to the best of my ability. The statute at issue was overly broad because it targeted speech that was made without the intent to intimidate, right? So they said, look, this is a true threats regulation, but we're going to target speech that is done on private property without targeting an individual. And you can't really threaten an entire community. You have to kind of threaten an individual. So, if I get up and say, I hate blank group of people, and I think they should get out of the country, or I think all sorts of horrible things should happen to that group of people. That is not a threat because it's a very large group. Threats have to be targeted. Now, not necessarily to one individual, but to a small group of individuals where you, as the listener, you hear it and you think, oh, goodness gracious, they're talking about me. They're not just talking about people of my race or gender or profession. But what the court did do is they left open the possibility of prohibiting cross burning within specified limits. I'm sorry, let's just say within, not without. So this allows for content-based laws, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. In RAV versus City of St. Paul, the court said you cannot single out cross burning. You cannot single out Nazi swastikas. But here they said that they could. You are able to target cross-burning. So you can pass a cross-burning statute that says, if you burn the cross in somebody's yard, or you do it with intent to intimidate, and we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you did it with the intent to intimidate, that can be a separate crime, a more severe crime than what we see with other types of true threats. That doesn't mean that the legislature also has to prohibit Nazi swastikas. They don't also have to prohibit burning a rainbow flag in the yard of a same-sex couple, right? You can target this particular type of true threat. However, it doesn't mean that you can discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. So, like, for example, I'm trying to think of how to do this carefully. So, let's say, hypothetically, that you had a statute that prohibited burning of, oh, here's one, okay. So let's say that you prohibit the burning of a Baptist flag. I don't know if there are Baptist flags. I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to assume for the sake of the argument that there are Baptist flags. You say, no, burning the Baptist flag in somebody's yard with the intent to intimidate is a separate type of crime. But if you do it for Catholics, or you do it for Methodists, or you do it for Lutherans, or Muslims, or whatever else, that's fine. That's viewpoint discrimination. That is never, ever, ever allowed. And so if you prohibited certain types of racist threats, but not others, okay, then you're in trouble. You're allowed to go after racism. Maybe leave sexism for another time, or homophobia, or ageism. Because racism, especially, has such a pervasive and difficult portion, history in our country, and in the past has been singled out in the Constitution in ways that other groups have not been. And Justice Thomas is a really, really interesting guy. And I think it's really tempting to kind of pigeonhole him as just like the most conservative guy on the Supreme Court, which he is, without a doubt. I know Scalia got a lot of flack for being the kind of, the conservative stalwart, but in a lot of ways, Justice Thomas is and was a lot more conservative. What he said, but I think that he has a really interesting argument here in a dissent to Virginia versus Black. What he said is that, look, cross-burning is not like anything else that we have seen in this country. It is unlike burning a rainbow flag in the yard of a same-sex couple. It is unlike a Nazi swastika on a Jewish temple. And that is because of America's historic race and racist violence against specific, against Black individuals and African Americans. We don't have the same historical issue with, I'm not in any way, Justice Thomas is not in any way diminishing the violence that LGBTQ people have gone through. He is not underselling the violence that Jews in this country have undergone, which I'm sure is significant. But nothing compares to the hundreds, if not thousands, of lynchings that occurred in the United States from the end of slavery to today. It does not compare to the enslavement of an entire race for the first 90 years of our country, right? And so to treat it as though it is the same as those others is ignorant of history. Additionally, there is no situation in which cross-burning is not threatening. Nobody in the history of the world, as far as Justice Thomas is concerned, burns a cross for any other reason to intimidate the ever-living crap out of the minority members of that community. This is not a religious issue. This is not a religious expression. This is not even a political expression. This is an expression whose only purpose is to make individuals of a community feel unwelcome and ask them to leave and make them feel threatened. Not ask them to leave, demand that they leave. He also believes that it's conduct and not expression. Justice Thomas really is skeptical of any argument that actual words have expressive value. And that is an incredibly conservative position. Like an insanely conservative position. Insane, I should not use insane. I'm not going to call a guy who went to Yale insane. But it is very conservative to a point where you're not going to find even one other vote on the Supreme Court to endorse that, much less 5. I mean, he also believes that churches, the First Amendment, parts of the First Amendment should not be incorporated against the state. So if Alabama wants to create the official Church of Alabama, that's fine. Again, he has a much more impressive resume than I do. That is going to be a fringe position, to say the very least. So, I think that that's interesting. I think that that's worth talking about, but is not anyway. It is not going to be a majority position. This is a dissent, which, as Jon Stewart said in America the Book, which is now very outdated, it's 16 or 17 years old now, but is essentially just a nice, formal fuck you to the other justices. It has no persuasive power whatsoever. It's just saying, here's why you're wrong. I'm going to put it down on the record. Okay, so that is True Threats. That is what we see, and it can get a little bit more complicated. But again, I'm trying to tailor this class to what you guys are going to go through in your career. I really present it in a way to just show you that the government is not able to pick and choose what can be prohibited on the basis of content, and cannot pick and choose what can be prohibited on the basis of viewpoint darn near ever. I am personally not aware of, and if somebody knows one, they can certainly correct me. I'm not aware where the government can pick and choose viewpoint and say one viewpoint is acceptable, the other one is not. It is almost certainly a dead on arrival argument to make to the Supreme Court, but that when you can try and prohibit types of speech, we have to do it in a very, very careful manner. The other thing that with True Threats is my hope is that you don't have to come across it all that much. Don't threaten people. Don't harass people. Don't stalk people. If you are doing something like that in your capacity as a journalist, in capacity as a media creator, chances are you're doing something wrong, and my class can't help you. Okay, so now this has been a really fun past 2 days, right? We've talked about Nazis, and we've talked about the KKK, and we've talked about the Westboro Baptist Church. It has been a very, very fun, happy topic, as I'm sure you guys are all aware. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little bit of a step back. The hard parts, the Nazis are done, as far as I know. I think they're done for a little bit. We don't talk about them again. And now we're going to move on to something that actually is really going to impact you, whether you go into journalism or whether you go into content creation from a media fictional standpoint or documentary filmmaking. We're going to talk about obscenity and indecency, and I'm going to play George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words, 7 things you cannot say on television. And then we will get into not only the bit itself, but also how it impacted media law moving forward. So, again, I'm going to try and make this work. It's kind of difficult with 2 separate places, but we're going to do our best.
What the hell? There are words that you can say, no problem. Topography! No one has ever gone to jail for screaming topography. But there are some words that you can go to jail for. There are some words that we just have decided we will not say all the time. Sometimes, okay. If you're running through the jungle chasing somebody that we're at war with, you can holler them. If you're shooting a criminal, it's okay. It's the all-American thing. Dirty fucking crook. But if you're with the bishop's wife at lunch, it's better not to ask for the goddamn lettuce. You know what I mean? It's just like we've decided there'll be some words we won't say all the time. And I was just trying to find out which words they were. For sure, all of them. I wanted a list. Because nobody gives you a list. That's the problem. They don't give you a list. Wouldn't you think it'd be normal if they didn't want you to say something to tell you what it is? Nobody even tells you when you're a kid what the words are that you're supposed to avoid. You have to say them to find out which ones they are. Shit! Oh, fuck! That's two. Oh, Ma, that's enough trial and error, huh? Please, Ma, give me a list, huh? All right, you're 6 years old now, and here's the list of words your dad and I don't ever want to hear you say. Oh, hey, thanks, Ma. Boy, that's going to save me an ass kicking or two. Yeah, you never know what's going to be on the list. Because it's always somebody else's list. You didn't make that up. Somebody told you that shit. They told you, better not say that. So you gotta, and you don't know what's going to be on their list. God, people's lists even change from day to day. Some people on Friday night got a list, about 2 or 3 words. Sunday morning, goddamn, there's 27 words. These are the same people 2 days later. Different list. So you got to kind of watch out what you're going to believe from them. The trouble is, I was trying to find out what these words might be. And I wanted to know the ones that you could never say on television. I mean the filthy words that are always filthy. There are a lot of these little two-way, double entendre words that have 2 meanings, words that are okay part of the time. I call them like part-time filth. Some of these words, they're only 50% dirty. You have words like ass. Ass is hardly even a dirty word anymore, but it has a few meanings that you can't say on television. That's what I was talking about. What can you say on television? That's another one of those places where we can't use these words all the time. But some of them are all right some of the time. Ass is all right on television. You can say on television things like, well, you've made a perfect ass of yourself tonight. But you can't say, hey, let's go get some ass. Bitch. Bitch is another word like that. Same kind of word. It's only dirty part of the time. Depends on what you mean by bitch. You might be the lady from the San Diego Zoo visiting one of the Tonight shows, and you might just have a bunch of little canines with you there. One of them is a female. You say, there's the bitch, Johnny, and it's okay, fine. Just don't refer to the singer the same way. That's all. Is that bitch going to do another number? Yes. Animals are fine on those two-way words, and that's it. That's what I was trying to find. The words that were always dirty, not just part of the time, but completely filth. Well, in looking for these words, I kept finding new categories. We have so many ways of describing these dirty words. We have more ways to describe dirty words than we actually have dirty words. That seems a little strange to me. It seems to indicate that somebody was awfully interested in these words. They kept referring to them. They called them bad words, dirty, filthy, foul, vile, vulgar, coarse, in poor taste, unseemly, street talk, gutter talk, locker room language, barracks talk, bawdy, naughty, saucy, raunchy, rude, crude, lewd, lascivious, indecent, profane, obscene, blue, off-color, risque, suggestive, cursing, cussing, swearing, and all I could think of was shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. That's all I had. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. That was my original list. I knew it wasn't complete, but it was a starter set, you know? Shit, piss, fuck, yes, WBAI is the one who played them. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. Now, that was the original list. We've added a few words since then. We've added fart, turd, and twat. And I know there are some other words that many of you are wondering about, why they haven't been considered, why they haven't shown up on the list thus far. We're looking at them all very closely. Some of your favorites might make the list this year. Asshole, ball bag, hard-on, piss hard, blue balls, taint, nookie, snatch, box, pussy, pecker, peckerhead, pecker tracks, jism, joint, Donecker, dork, poontang, cornhole, and dingleberry. Dingleberry, a very popular word. And to my way of thinking, dingleberry, a rather innocent-sounding word. Dingleberry sounds Christmassy to me, you know. Let's put one on the tree, Dad.
There we go. Okay, so that is George Carlin, the comedian, who sadly died. Stop again. Okay. Sadly died a few years ago. So we're going to be talking about obscenity and indecency. And in popular culture and in everyday life, these are synonyms. They can be used interchangeably by and large without there being much of an issue. But one of the things that we really look at when it comes to law is the need for precise language and using that language to communicate specific legal issues and legal concepts. So let's look at those definitions. Obscenity is a narrow class of hardcore sexual or excitorily material so offensive and lacking in social value, it is denied First Amendment protection altogether. 2, indecency is sexual or excretory activities described in a patently offensive manner. And pornography doesn't have a legal definition. If you go into a court of law and you say this should be protected or this should be prohibited because it is pornographic, the court is going to say, well, what the heck does pornographic mean? Justice Potter Stewart said in a case called Jacobellis versus Ohio, well, pornography, I know it and I see it, right? It's going to be really hard for me to say what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. But I'm not about to give you a specific list of criteria. And so we have this little cartoon, which I know is kind of difficult to see, so I'll explain it, which is always the best way to consume a cartoon is when somebody explains it to you. But on the left, we got a guy watching, really violent war flick, and he's enjoying himself and liking it, but then we see 2 adult people kissing, and he goes, obscenity, bad, right? And unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your point of view, I imagine most people would say, unfortunately, that stuck-up old guy watching the TV is absolutely correct. Look, and one of the things that people always miss, because typically this is it's going to be included in something where you have to make an argument, right? Either your legal argument or your final exam or your oral argument, your legal analysis. Somebody will always say, well, it's obscene because it's violent, or obscene because it's hateful, or obscene because I just plain don't like it. Both obscenity and indecency, the first thing we look at is a narrow class of hardcore sexual or excretory material. That is it. It is not a measure for what society finds offensive or harmful or lacking in social value. It is only sexual or excretory material. And one of the ways I'm going to try and have you guys remember this, I don't feel too terribly bad for cursing in this class considering the clip we just watched. If it is not shitting or fucking, it is not obscenity or indecency. It's not. Violence, not obscene, not indecent. Racism, not obscene, not indecent. Bad words, not obscene, not indecent, unless they are talking about obscenity and indecency. Or talking about sexual or excretory activity. Okay, so let's start with obscenity. And I'm going to blow through obscenity hopefully by the end of class because it is not something that we are typically going to spend too much time in. And we'll see why here in a little bit. Now, obscenity is entitled to no constitutional protection. Now, it took the Supreme Court a really, really, really long time to actually define what is obscene, but they finally did it in a case called Miller versus California in 1973. And this is my weekly reminder. I do not expect you guys to remember that it is Miller versus California, but that it was decided in 1973. There is one case I will be testing you the name of the case on. It is the New York Times versus Sullivan. We will talk about it, I think, in a couple of weeks, maybe next week. I will tell you that I want you to remember it, so you don't need to worry about it right now. Otherwise, all I need you guys to know is the legal concepts that come out of these cases. You know, half the time, if you ask me what case dealt with, that actually laid out the Supreme Court's definition of obscenity, I got about 50-50 chance that I'd be able to identify, and I teach this stuff. It's just not that relevant to what we're doing here. But anyway, something will be deemed obscene if the average citizen, applying contemporary community standards, would find that the work taken as a whole appears to what we call the prurient interest. Prurient means perverted, for lack of a better term. Sex for the sake of sex. Okay? The material must depict or describe sexual conduct specifically defined by state law. So the state cannot simply pass a law that says anything that we find gross is obscene. Anything related to sex that we find gross is obscene. It has to be relatively specifically enumerated, because one of the things that a court is always very, very skeptical of is regulations or laws that do not put a potential speaker on notice as to what they are or are not allowed to say, view, or distribute. Because if you have vague and difficult to decipher laws, then you're not going to have people go right up to the edge of what is allowed, which is what we want in a free society. We want people to be able to explore the limits of what is legally allowed when it comes to expression. So we push boundaries, it's how we challenge people, it's how we have robust public debate about things of public concern. But if you have vague laws that are subject to the whims of a jury or the whims of a judge or whatever else, then people aren't going to get right here when it comes to saying what is allowed. They're going to give it a wide berth. They're going to kind of go here. And then all this speech that would theoretically be allowed and potentially even important to the public discourse is not going to be said. It's called a chilling effect. And then finally, the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Okay, that is what is theoretically a three-part test. All three parts must be met in their entirety for an obscenity charge to stand. If a defendant charged with obscenity can prove that any aspect of this test is not met, it is not illegal. Obscenity is not found. And so theoretically, it's a three-part test, but let's look at it actually. And we'll go through them kind of individually. We're looking at the average citizen, number one, applying contemporary community standards, number two. We find that the work, number three, taken as a whole, number four, appears to period interest, number five. The material must depict or describe sexual conduct, number six, specifically defined by state law, number seven. The work, taken as a whole, again, number eight, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. That is 9 distinct things that must be met in order for an obscenity charge to stand. Let me give you an example. If the first two parts are met, and we look at the work as a whole, but it has serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, it's not obscenity. No matter how much it appeals to the prurient interest, no matter how offensive it is. So let's look at these individually. We got an average person. An average person is a typical member of a community. Okay? And here is where legal theory and legal reality tend to diverge a little bit, at least in my opinion. Everybody thinks they're an average person, right? Everybody thinks that they are kind of the barometer for normal. I would say that like 90% of people think that they're good drivers, and then they think 90% of other people are bad drivers. So everybody kind of thinks that they are average, that they're normal. And they're, you know, when you have political surveys, they all ask, like, does somebody care about an average individual? And like 90% of people will say that they are average, and that the political candidate either does or does not care about them. Well, 90% of people cannot be average. That's not how it works. But theoretically, if you are tasked with determining whether or not obscenity is present in a particular case, you're not going to be Quagmire from Family Guy, kind of the pervy, skeevy guy next door. You're also not going to be Ned Flanders from Simpsons, whose hang-ups on sexuality are, you know, comedic fodder a lot of times. They're going to say just like a random, regular person. And so if you put Ned Flanders or Quagmire in a jury box, looking at whether or not something is obscene, they're not going to say, me as an individual, do I find this appeals to the prurient interest? You're going to say, to my friends and my neighbors, do they think that it appeals to the prurient interest? Now, my opinion, you put somebody in a jury box, they're going to use their own opinion. They're going to use their own judgment. Theoretically, they're not supposed to. Okay, so one of my favorite things is from the 2016 Olympics. I hope we have the Olympics again at some point. We'll talk about the FCC here in a second. And what the FCC allows is for people to submit complaints about particular programming. That thing was offensive, and you should regulate it or punish somebody, right? And actually several people, wrote in to the FCC saying that the outfits in the Olympics, you know, these guys in short shorts and the women wearing their, you know, having their midriffs exposed when they're running on track or whatever else, that it was essentially pornography, right? Definitely highly offensive. Children should not be watching that whatsoever. And it is so indecent that it is patently offensive and should be taken off air. Now, I'm not asking you whether or not you believe that. That's your right as an American citizen. Do you think that the society as a whole would agree with the proposition that somebody running in a tank, or, you know, I mean, you see this. You see what female and male runners run in. Find it patently offensive, pornographic, worthy of an R or NC-17 rating? No. So this spirited individual who wrote the FCC, they are not representative of the population at large. Actually, one of the really kind of interesting things that I see when it comes to obscenity, which I think is difficult to justify legally, and I still am not entirely sure how the Supreme Court got to this conclusion. But for something to be obscene, it must be obscene as it's defined by a local community. Why that's on there twice, I don't know. I do apologize. I should really proofread these things better. But we're talking about a local community. The question is like, well, what is a local community? And the answer is, we're not really sure. But a town or a city or a county. Smaller than a state, bigger than a neighborhood. Maybe the jurisdiction. Again, not heavily litigated as an issue. So there, as far as I know, there's not a lot of like real distinct guidance on this. But there is no nationwide standard as a general rule. So the problem that you run into is it allows for forum shopping. Forum shopping is essentially where a particular party, in this case the prosecution, will bring a case in the most favorable jurisdiction for their claim. So let me give you an example. You are and this is going to this is going to necessitate stereotyping, okay? It just is, because you are judging communities based on widely held beliefs. And so obviously they're actually going to differ a fair amount between individuals, but as a whole, we can say that Texas is different than North Carolina culturally, is different than Vermont, is different than California. So yes, we're stereotyping. That's the point of what we're doing here. But let's say you want to bring a obscenity charge against somebody. Are you going to do that in the hipster part of Brooklyn? Or are you going to bring that charge in the heavily Mormon parts of Utah? Which one are you more likely to get a finding that the material applies to essentially perverted interests? Utah, right? Because stereotypically, they're going to have a much higher, a much less forgiving view of sexually explicit material, for whatever reason, than super progressive parts of New York City. And when we're talking about things being distributed online, now that was fine when people distributed stuff by handing out pamphlets in the local square, or putting on picture shows in the local theater or back alley or wherever else. That's fine. We have actual we have communities that by and large interact with each other. But since 1973, we have the internet. Now, when images and things are being distributed via the internet, what standard applies? When anybody in the country can access it, should we apply the community of the receiver? Should we apply the community of the sender? Should we look at the community of the place in which it's shown? So if you put something on, let's say, a subreddit or a Discord server or a Twitter feed, should we look at the makeup of those users? It's not an easy question. And one of the reasons why, even if the community standard prong of the obscenity test was justifiable in the 1970s, and I don't think it was, but even if you say that it is, it's gone. And it's created a really interesting circuit split. The Ninth Circuit says, because of the internet, the community standard prong is gone, right? You don't need to look at it. It's a nationwide standard because information is distributed on a worldwide scale with the click of a button. The 11th Circuit said, no, you can look at communities. You can look at the places where it was received. I think the Supreme Court at a certain point is going to have to step in and resolve this. Maybe. We also don't see a ton of obscenity prosecutions anymore, right? Every once in a while, you'll get a president or a governor who's really that's their crusade is the evil of sex and popular culture or whatever else. You don't see it a lot. I think if there is a movement to do it again, I think you're going to have the court have to reevaluate the community standard portion of this in the internet age. They just haven't done it yet because they got other stuff to deal with, I guess. Okay, now, it's got to be patently offensive, right? So we're talking about an average person, we're talking about the prurient interest, now we're talking about patently offensive. And again, I'm going to be as diplomatic as I can about this. You can't leave a lot up to the imagination, right? It has to be actual images of sexual or excitatory activities. What is important is that by and large, mere nudity, there's a naked guy, there's a naked girl, there's a naked person, not patently offensive. Because otherwise, people down at the art department do is patently offensive. And sure, while I probably don't want, some naked person just parading outside my son's preschool, by and large, people not without their clothes on, it's not so crazy that people lose their minds over it. Language can be prosecuted, but it's incredibly difficult simply because we'll see, by and large, language is going to have some sort of literary safeguard. So by and large, again, we're talking about pictures and videos. Now, can you guys start to begin to understand why, unless you are going into a very specific part of media creation, that this is not really going to be something that you deal with all that often? But I still think it's important that we kind of know where obscenity stops and indecency, as we'll see next class, begins. Social value. It's got to have two aspects. The work taken as a whole. So if you are looking at a movie, you are looking at a picture, you are looking at something, you can't crop out the part that you find really, really bad. Game of Thrones has some really gross stuff in there. And, you know, there are a lot of scenes that take place in a brothel in Game of Thrones that maybe don't need to take place in a brothel. But if you are trying to make the argument that Game of Thrones is obscene, you can't just take that 3 minutes where they're explaining a bunch of really boring backstory while naked people are parading around them. You have to look at the entire show, and you have to talk, and you have to consider how the alleged obscenity fits into the context of the larger picture. Same goes with like a series of photographs. And then serious social value is defined as serious literary, artistic, political, and scientific value. Now this part, and this is where I really get off the court's whole, we're going to let communities define what is obscene and what is not, is this is a nationwide standard. What has literary value is a nationwide standard. So according to the Supreme Court, communities should be able to identify what is appealing to the prurient interest, what is patently offensive. But they should not be able to identify what has literary and social value. That seems inconsistent to me, personally. But I'm not on the Supreme Court. Don't ask me. And this is really going to be given a wide berth, right? So by and large, the court really is going to give the benefit of the doubt to finding social and literary value. Because again, the Supreme Court is going to be very, very concerned about over-regulation creating this buffer between what is allowed and what is actually being said. They don't want to have that chilling effect where people are afraid to kind of really go up to that line. So when in doubt, they're going to find serious literary, artistic, and political and scientific value. So like, let's look at an example of what I'm talking about. This is Wolf of Wall Street. It's just the trailer. And why I'm showing it to you, hopefully will be made clear here in a second. But this is the trailer, okay? Then we'll talk about.
My name is Jordan Belfort. The year I turned 26, I made $49 million, which really pissed me off because it was 3 shy of $1 million a week.
We're making a name for ourselves.
Nobody knows if the stock is gonna go up, down, sideways, or in circles. You know what Fugazi is?
Oh, Fugazi, it's fake.
Yeah, Fugazi, it's a wazi, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust.
Was all this legal? Absolutely not. We were making more money than we knew what to do with.
We don't work for you, man.
Yeah, my money take your dues. Technically, you do work for me.
What's wrong, Daddy?
Oh my God. FBI, any kind of booze you might want? No, the Bureau forbids us from drinking. Duh.
So follow me, you could about to go. I'm doing 500, I'm out of control. But there's nowhere to go. And there's no way to slow. If I knew what I knew in the past, I would have been like that on your.
How does this actually work?
There's a big money sign.
They get launched at the time, they stick.
This is their gift, okay? They're built to be thrown like a lawn dart.
Stop. Okay?
Safety first.
Safety is first. We don't want to get a bad reputation.
In the morning, and I'm zoning, I think I'm possessed. It's an omen, I keep it 300, like the Romans, 300. We're the Trojans, baby, we living in the moment. I've been a menace for the longest, and you know it, and you know it, and you know it, and you know
Mm-hmm. Come on. Yeah.
Okay, so why did I show this to you guys? Now, has anybody seen Wolf of Wall Street? It is one of the dirtiest movies I have ever seen. And this has nothing to do with class, but I like telling the story. Anyway, my wife and I have a habit when movie theaters used to be a thing, which apparently they're not anymore, just to kind of annoy my mom, who's really into Christmas. We just try and go see like the least appropriate movie during Christmas that we possibly can. And so in 2013, it was Wolf of Wall Street, and somebody brought a 2-year-old to see Wolf of Wall Street. So whenever I think I'm being a bad parent, at least I'm not taking my 2-year-old to a Wolf of Wall Street screening on Christmas night. But anyway, it has a lot of really, 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 really filthy stuff in there. And I'm sure that there were a lot of people out there who wanted to say that this was obscene, that they wanted to bring an obscenity charge against Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio and Terrence Winter and anybody else who was involved in the making of this movie. But they're not going to be able to take those really dirty scenes and look at them in isolation. They're going to have to look at them in the context of the entire movie. And while there is a fair amount of debauchery and over-the-top sexuality in Wolf of Wall Street, including both language, images, and descriptions of a heck of a lot of stuff, you're going to have a really hard time making an argument that it's obscene. Because the point of Wolf of Wall Street, despite some people kind of misunderstanding what the purpose of it is to show this excess that comes with this unbridled exploitation of the stock market. The kind of people who, you know, especially, I mean, you saw this in things like The Big Short had a lot of this stuff in it as well, which came out around the same time. And it's supposed to make you mad. It's supposed to be like, this is how these people are living while the rest of the economy gets absolutely screwed. And you wouldn't be able to tell that story as effectively if you didn't actually show the debauchery. You didn't actually get to show the over-the-top sexuality that is kind of at the heart of these people's greed. And even if not everybody necessarily gets that, it's apparent that by showing the graphicness of this, that there is a purpose behind it. There's an artistic purpose. That there's a message behind it. It's not, again, sex for the sake of sex. And that is why obscenity is so incredibly difficult to meet as a standard. Because when you're looking at something that is distributed in movies or distributed on TV or whatever else, or in a book, most of the time, almost all of the time, there's going to be some social value there. Now, this is also kind of important. Possession of obscenity is protected, but it's protected in a different way. And it's a weird decision that I find really, really interesting, actually, that I don't really understand. And I've read it, and I'm not saying that the outcome is bad, right? We don't want people breaking down doors and arresting people for having something in their home. But it doesn't really square with me as to how obscenity is treated. Or looking at things like drug laws. But let me give you some background first. In Stanley versus Georgia, Stanley was a guy who they were executing a search warrant. I think they're just looking for guns or something. And they came across a bunch of magazines. And bad, dirty pictures. And they arrested him for the guns, and they also arrested him because of possession of obscenity. And the Supreme Court said that that was constitutionally protected, right? And the quote that I find really interesting is that if the First Amendment means anything, it means that a state has no business telling a man sitting alone in his own house what books he may read or what films he may watch. Our whole constitutional heritage rebels at the thought of giving government the power to control men's minds. I'm having a really hard time on a personal level making the exact same argument for marijuana, right? You're sitting in your own home, you're not bothering anybody, it's a mind-altering substance. All the arguments that we're about to make against obscenity can also be applied to drugs. I'm not saying that you should be able, I'm not taking a position on drug legalization or marijuana decriminalization or anything like that, okay? Just simply, when we look at obscenity, why we prevent it, why we allow the government to say this material can be regulated in a way that other speech cannot be, we look at really three things. We look at preventing those who don't want to see obscene materials from seeing them. So if obscenity is speech, then the government is given incredibly limited ability to regulate it, which means you can just put obscene images up on a billboard as you're driving down I-40. Or you can put a pornographic movie theater next door to a preschool. It has a lot of societal things that people would really be uncomfortable with. It allows for the regulation of that, okay? And it prevents people from accidentally seeing it and people who do not wish to consume it from being forced to see it. Number two, it prevents the enticement of people to view obscene materials through advertising. Again, this is what we're going to look at when it talks about commercial speech and things like cigarettes. We prevent people from smoking by stopping people from trying to entice people to smoke. We're not going to let them put ads on billboards. We're not going to let them do advertisements during the Super Bowl. There were no Marlboro ads during the Super Bowl last night. And that is because of an understanding that one of the ways to cut down on a sinful activity, for lack of a better term, which consumption of obscenity is, according to according to governments, that you prevent people from trying to talk somebody else into consuming it. And finally, prevent profiting off of this obscene materials, right? So you can't, we want people making money off of this. None of these things apply to obscenity. Now, you can make the exact same argument for a lot of other things that the government prevents you from doing in your own home. But the argument, and again, and this is where it gets really confusing, and I understand it's confusing. Because the argument is that marijuana is just conduct. Marijuana is just a thing, right? There's no expressive element that comes with marijuana or the consumption of marijuana. And if you agree with that, fine. But we just established that obscenity is not speech, and so it can be regulated the same as anything else. So I don't think that these decisions square all that well, personally. I don't think they kind of fit in that nice jigsaw puzzle that we're led to believe the law is. But that's what the law is. Right? As it stands right now, obscenity can be widely prohibited, widely regulated in the same way non-speech things are regulated and prohibited. However, possession and consumption of obscene materials in your own home, constitutionally protected. And I'm going to spend literally 4 minutes on this. Child pornography is different for a lot of different reasons. But everything I just went over, everything about obscenity applies to adults. Okay? When we're talking about children under the age of 18, these standards are completely different. You can be arrested for possessing it. You can be arrested for things that have artistic value. You can be arrested and charged for things that are not as high of a burden than we have with adults. one thing it is that it does have to be, there has to be sexual depictions. So that doesn't mean every time my mom posts that really embarrassing picture of me in the tub when I was 4 years old, that's not child pornography because there's no sexual element to it. So it's not prohibiting nudity in and of itself, which is why we have the picture from the Vietnam War over to the side, right? I mean, that's a naked child, but there's no sexual aspect to it. We're trying to show how horrible napalm is, not anything else. So that's allowed, that's fine. But if there is that sort of additional element there, then it can be prohibited. And the purpose is really protecting kids, right? There is no ability consent there at all. Having that exist continues to inflict long-term damage on the child, even as they age. And by definition, pretty much without exception, child pornography is evidence of abuse because children cannot consent, okay? And because of that, allowing the evidence of abuse to continue to exist perpetuates that abuse. And it re-traumatizes that particular individual. Here's my thing, and I really, this is not something that, you know how it's said that in a good and polite society, there is value in having prohibited speech right here and everybody kind of getting right up here, right? Exploring that outer bounds of what is acceptable. That is how we grow and challenge preconceived notions of society. Again, a little bit soapboxy, and I apologize. This is not something where you should be right here, okay? This is something where my sincere hope is that you don't have to deal with stuff like this. This should not be part of your eventual career. I just wanted to make it clear that when we're dealing, everything we're talking about right now, we're talking about adults. It is incredibly separate and much more criminal, to be honest with you, just to simply, you know, you can see how with obscenity, art and obscenity can get intertwined, right? And there can be that kind of crossover where it's tricky to draw that line. You're not going to have that same issue here. So my hope is that you don't have to come across it. You don't plan on coming across it. Okay, so we're actually going to end it there. Before we pack up, though, I have finally gotten the YouTube. I sound like an 80-year-old person. I've gotten the YouTube to work. And so those will be uploaded tonight. They are finally done. What I'm going to be doing, I'm just going to be sending you a link. Last week, I tried to spend about 30 minutes trying to make studio work. God bless anybody who can do it. I can't. So it'll just be YouTube. If you missed a class, watch it. And then we also will have our first Canvas discussion. So be on the lookout for that. Watch at some point People versus Larry Flynt. Again, this will all be on Canvas. You don't have to write it down right now. And your first Canvas discussion assignment will be due on Sunday. So you have a whole week to do it. It's a good movie. I really encourage you guys to watch it. Woody Harrelson's in it. Courtney Love's in it. And if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Sound good? All right, you guys. I appreciate it, and I will see you on Wednesday.